to start off our 4 presentations about our core research areas, we're going to start with Professor Julie Champion, talking about biomolecular engineering, sort of corner of the department.
Well, I'm going to introduce biomolecular engineering at CHBE, and as you heard from Hong and Mark, right, there's a lot of integration with the bioengineering program. Some students are in that and some students are not, so you don't have to be BioE to do biotech research at Georgia Tech, but many are and many aren't. So there's a lot of ways to do biomolecular engineering here. All right, so really what motivates us in the biomolecular area is sort of these big questions and big challenges. So as you know, sort of think about humanity and the earth and what's going on. Some of the things that really drive what we're doing are things like, right, the changing environment. And while our friends in the nanomaterials and the energy sector certainly are working on ways to deal with CO2, ways to make processes more efficient. On the bio side, right, we are interested, for example, in drought and how can we maybe engineer plants to grow in the conditions that might be more prevalent. As you think about how disease is changing, right, as our earth is changing, diseases are changing. They are moving in different geographical areas, and still there's a really large number of people in the world who don't have access to medicines that they need for different diseases, both in developed and undeveloped countries, right? Drugs are expensive, but also we don't have a lot of drugs for conditions that are really affecting a lot of people. Of course, this one is here. A lot of us have been, stepped up when COVID presented itself. And what we found is some of the things we're working on are still needed, as well as some of the projects that we identified can pivot now to other viruses, including pandemics that may be coming in the future. So these are really the things that drive us. Like, what are these big challenges and how can we apply our research to them? So I'll just go through sort of a couple categories where we sort of hit some of these. And so, one is how can we make affordable diagnostics? So you heard from Saad, about how he's making paper centrifuges, for example, that cost less than $1. So you can have a blood sample and without any electricity or training, right, that blood sample could be processed and ultimately a person tested, in a low resource area. The Styczynski lab also has similar projects. They focus on a different aspect though, on micronutrient deficiency. So we all know about hunger and famine, on the sort of global scale, right? When you see a child who is, skinny and starving, and that certainly needs to be addressed. And within hunger though, right, there are deficiencies of particular nutrients, for example, zinc. And right, you can tell if a child is hungry by looking at them, but you can't tell if a child is zinc deficient by looking at them. And so coming up with strategies to be able to detect these things in low resource settings is something that they work on. The Prowses lab works with microneedles, and maybe you've heard of microneedles for delivery, but this is actually needles that are sucking stuff out. So they are able to take some of the fluid that's in your tissue and detect diseases from a really shallow microneedle array that is painless. And Alex Abramson, our brand new faculty member, is developing strain sensors. So when a tumor is growing, it's pushing right on the tissue around it. And so could you actually have a device, instead of measuring chemical cues, right, that measures physical cues and how cancer is developing or establishing using physical cues? So that's a brand new project. Another group of us is really looking at, okay, if we're going to know where to go in the future, maybe we should reflect on how we kind of got here in the first place, right? And so how do these reaction networks that ultimately gave rise to life? So Lily Chung is looking at certainly how plants transport sugars, right? If plants can't move sugars up this height, then there are no plants. There is no plant life. Martha Grover is this is one of her pictures, right? How do we even get the first RNA or DNA, right? How did individual molecules come together, polymerize, and ultimately become self-replicating? And so these are things that she works on within the Center for Chemical Evolution at Georgia Tech. And Pamela Peralta-Yaha is looking at how can we take some of these networks that have evolved over time and use them to make things that oil used to make. So produce valuable products in a more sustainable way. On the therapeutic side, there's a lot of therapeutic work going on here. So there's a big group of us And this is a picture from the Kane lab showing a virus-like particle that they have been able to decorate with antigens from SARS-CoV-2 and show some really nice data on cross-protective vaccines. That is, vaccines that protect against not just the original strain that sort of long gone, right? But the strains that don't even exist yet. We still need vaccines to be evolving and ideally protecting against strains that don't even exist yet. This is actually a picture from my lab of this hexameric assembly made out of 6 alpha helices that's capable of delivering other therapeutic proteins attached to it inside of cells. So right now, basically all protein drugs on the market, they are outside of cells. They don't go inside of cells. And so we are missing this huge untapped space of all the business of a cell is, sort of going on inside of it. And when we only can affect the outside, right, we're sort of cleaning up the mess, but we're not stopping the mess from being made in the first place. And so intracellular delivery is a big challenge that we're working on. Blair Bretman is working on using processing methods with cellulose to better formulate drugs, right? So they might be taken orally instead of being injected. And how do you sort of integrate polymers with medicines in the formulation space. And then we have our microneedle patches, which the Prousens lab is using to deliver lots of different things, from birth control to vaccines to all sorts of different sorts of medicines. And Alex, as I mentioned on the previous 2 slides, he's developing these they're almost like little robots, but they're sort of Weeble Wobble toys. Probably not old enough to know what those are, but these little capsules that can orient themselves in the stomach and then inject a drug through the wall of the stomach. And so the engineering that goes into this is really pretty cool. So another group of us is building things. So how can we build molecules, build structures? And this is the picture from Andy Mamaris's work, right, where he is making pharmaceutical precursors from enzymes that he's engineered in his lab and putting those enzymes on scaffolds. And he actually has, small scale reactors going on where they are making drug precursors, in flow reactors. This is a picture from Johnny Blazek's group where they are using yeast as manufacturers for therapeutic antibodies. And so being able to cross-cut some of the challenges of making large antibodies with new platforms for discovering antibody fragments that you can then engineer for any target is really powerful. And this picture here from the Pamela Peralta Yaha, this is the new picture. Is using, so you can see sort of all this CO2 here, right? So identifying mechanisms and pathways by which you can alter metabolism to control CO2 flux and to make molecules that are needed in a much more sustainable way. And she and Mark Styczynski are sort of co-leaders of BioMate, this industrial and academic sort of biomanufacturing institute that is promoting this sort of work in order to move our manufacturing into the next phase. All right, there we go. So another group of us is making pretty pictures out of proteins. But what these pretty pictures really represent are materials that we've created that have extraordinary function or have things that we can learn in biology. So the Paravastu lab, highlighted by these pictures here, they work on studying peptide amyloid formation. So you've all heard of Alzheimer's disease, right, and amyloid plaques. And so there's really multiple areas of his research. One is understanding how those form, right? So maybe we can interfere with that. But another one is not all amyloids are bad. In fact, you all have a lot of amyloids of different kinds in your bodies, and that they can form really valuable things like hydrogels, like stabilizing structures. They can be very, very stable. And so using them as biomaterials is an area that they're looking at. And they particularly use NMR to focus on how that structure forms. This is a protein vesicle from our own lab that is capable of presenting biocatalysts as well as delivering enzymes and vaccines into cells. And so there's a lot of space going on, or a lot of work going on here in terms of the ability to form structures from materials. And we have really a lot of people working with proteins now compared to when I came 14 years ago. So another one is really, sort of understanding, going back in part to like, how do we get here? But there's a lot of really cool critters on Earth, as Saad mentioned some of them, right? This is like the fastest single cell organism on Earth. How does it work? How does it regenerate so much force? And maybe that would be useful in designing a robot. How do C. elegans, so the humble worm, right? How does their brain function? Because turns out that we are really, really similar to them genetically. And we can count all of their neurons and see exactly where each one is and how it's firing and communicating and mapping that. We can't do that, right, in a human brain. And so the Liu Lab is really studying how those neural networks act and what can we learn from that to apply to human health. And then finally, how do we understand and detect human disease? So the Styczynski Lab does a lot of mass spectrometry and looking at metabolism and how disease changes the metabolism of a body or tissue, and understanding how that might be able to use for detection or perhaps even for treatment. Johnny Blazek's lab is looking at the T cell environment. When you have a tumor, T cells, in theory, right, are supposed to fight that tumor. They're supposed to clear those cancer cells, but they don't. So how is that immune suppression happening, and how might we be able to reverse that? So I didn't even talk about half the pictures and half the faces here, but I wanted to give you sort of an idea of the things that we're interested in and the grand challenges that we hit. And so we collaborate with a lot of different people, right? We're engineers. You need help from medical doctors. You need help from experts in infectious disease and in all sorts of different expertise. And so we have a lot of different collaborators and people who are, really local. The Georgia Aquarium, the Styczynski Lab has a collaboration with them, to groups that are around the world. And just to give you an idea of what some of our students do. So our students are really amazing. Some of them have won some great awards. So Stephen and Thomas won the Sigma Chi Best PhD thesis and Best MS thesis. So that's about all of Georgia Tech. And last year, BioMolecular at ChemE swept the Sigma Chi Thesis Award. So that's really incredible. Fernanda and Jan were selected for the MIT ChemE Rising Stars. And Jan also won a Caltech Presidential Fellowship. And then you can see where people have gone, right? So we have life sciences, consulting, postdocs, and then we have a lot of different companies ranging from the ones you might think, Eli Lilly and GSK to things like McKinsey and others. And just some great news from the last year. You can see we've had some really high profile papers come up, as well as some really fantastic awards. So Dr. Bamarius, an AICHE fellow, Mark Prausnitz elected to the Academy of Engineering, and some new innovators and MIT Innovator Under 35, as well as a lot of cool grants that sort of highlight where are the new projects going, right? What are we starting next year and the year after? So I have talked really fast to get in my 15 minutes. I don't think we have any time for questions, but thank you for listening to me, and I hope to meet a lot of you.
Great. All right. Thanks again, Julie, for the presentation. So next, I'd like to welcome Professor Marta Hatzel, and she'll be talking about our efforts in sustainability, separations, and energy.
Well, thanks for having me. I will admit, these are Ryan's slides, which I augmented, or Professor Lively's slides, who I augmented. And so I'm new to the department, not new to Georgia Tech. And so he graciously let me come and give this talk today. So this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, and hopefully all of yours. Sustainability and decarbonization and electrification is kind of going to be one of the great contributions of your lifetimes. We're at a really exciting part it's the most exciting part of working in sustainability of my whole career right now. Who has heard of the Inflation Reduction Act? Good, great, well educated, good. So last year, President Biden, got through one of the greatest legislations in our lifetime, which is finally investing in large-scale infrastructure changes to decarbonize most of our society. And it's late, but it's really important, and it's injected a flood of money and into research and development related to sustainability. And so, and the good thing about it is that Georgia Tech is one of the leading research if not, I would say the leading department in the United States that tackles these topics like CO2 sequestration, chemical manufacturing, electrification of vehicles, grid scale energy storage. And so if you want to work on sustainability, decarbonization, and electrification within chemical engineering, I think Georgia Tech is probably the #1 department in that space. So with that, as you guys know, we have this great challenge, which is that we've been emitting a lot of carbon dioxide and have to basically change courses. We have to rethink a lot of the processes that modern society is built on. And this is because we've seen this rise in CO2 emissions, right? And so a lot of people have been looking at this, making big back of the envelope calculations. And we know that if business remains as usual, we're going to see greenhouse gases emissions peak around 2050 and 2060. And so that's why governments across the world have come up with this goal of net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And so it's 2023, right? 2050 is not that far. Actually, 2050 corresponds with my 64th birthday. So I say, if we can decarbonize by 2050, I get to retire a year early, right? So that's, I don't have 5-year goals personally or 10-year goals, but I do have the 2050 goal for myself and the world, which is to decarbonize. And so this is where basically the Inflation Reduction Act is really injecting money in. What do we need to do to decarbonize? And it's interesting because we have pathways to decarbonize a lot of our sectors. Does anyone own an electric vehicle? No, not yet, but you will, right? I don't either, but we're going to see a rapid, and honestly, you can't buy them right now because there's just not enough of them to buy. And so the supply chains are short. And so even if you wanted to buy an electric vehicle, it's hard because we don't have manufacturing up to speed yet, but the Inflation Reduction Act is going to address that. So we have pathways to decarbonize ground transportation, and that's going to be switching to electric vehicles. But we don't have clear pathways to decarbonizing chemical manufacturing, which chemical engineers are critical for. We don't have pathways for decarbonizing, just our atmosphere. And so there's going to be, especially in the industrial sector, there's going to be a real challenge for chemical engineers to figure out that pathway to decarbonization. We can turn off our fossil fuel power plants and turn on a solar plant. That's good. We got that. We can retire our IC engines and we can buy electric vehicles. But chemical engineers, you guys are going to be developing ways to decarbonize the chemical manufacturing industry and how to decarbonize just industrial processes in general. And so that is largely what all of the faculty who work in this space at Georgia Tech focus on, which is basically how do you decarbonize catalysis processes and how do you decarbonize separations processes. And as you've all taken your process engineering courses, catalysis and separations are required for nearly all processes. And so that is what most of us here work on. And so what's also been found is that even if we quickly decarbonize all of these sectors, we still have a problem, and that is that we have too high of a CO2 in the atmosphere. And so while it would be nice to not have to do anything about that, there is also a growing need and acknowledgement by society that you're going to need to also implement larger scale carbon capture, both from point sources, right, which we already do today, but also direct air capture systems. And so it's not ideal. We would like to be able to just reverse our issues that we've created, but it's been widely understood that we're probably also going to have to implement that direct air capture. And so those are some grand challenges that are taking place. And so, essentially there's going to be lots of different technologies that we have to retire. We're going to have to capture our carbon, and then we're going to have to move towards more renewable energy systems. And so what has caused a lot of this issue is strongly correlated with population growth. It's interesting to see that, we're reaching this 8 billion people on Earth. And so, sustainability connects to all humans. in that we're trying to make life better for the 8 billion people on this earth. And so the nice thing about us working in sustainability is that you often are, all of our technologies directly impact humans by increasing the quality of life. And so this is just a little breakdown about what's going on right now. As you can see, we've had a lot of coal use in the United States. I'm from Pennsylvania, and right when I was going to school, they discovered the Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania, and so natural gas really started to take off as a potentially clean fuel and feedstock because of that. And actually, I remember when I joined Georgia Tech in 2015, everyone here was like natural gas is the future, but it's really just an intermediate step, right? Because yes, it's cleaner than coal, but it still emits CO2. And so, but fast forward 2015 to 2023, no one's saying that natural gas is the future. The future really is in renewables, and that's pretty clear. And so we can see that basically the growth in these sectors, and by 2050, I think that these numbers will actually be higher than 28% renewables, just because of the Inflation Reduction Act. Because actually, yeah, so Ryan made this, and this is from the 2017 outlook, which didn't take into consideration the Inflation Reduction Act. And so I actually think that these are conservative estimates on where we see the energy sector going. And so now that brings you to what we're doing at Georgia Tech. I kind of alluded to these topics of really decarbonizing all catalytic processes and decarbonizing all separations processes. But the interesting thing is, what do we do actually in this space? Well, carbon capture is one of the large areas. We actually have just kicked off a carbon capture center. Ryan Lively, I think, is leading that. And we have some of the world's best experts in carbon capture, specifically related to direct air capture. And so if you have any interest in going to this space, one, there's a ton of jobs as well. We can't keep our students in school because all of the companies are grabbing you guys quicker than we can produce PhDs. Because there's just so many jobs in this space because of the growing marketplace. And so, Professor Walton, Scholl, Ralph, Lively, and Jones all work in this space. And in addition to them starting a direct air capture center, they're actually also starting to create a local regional hub for direct air capture, which Professor Ralph is leading. And so if you want to work in this space, you're going to be connected to industry and the cutting edge. You're going to be doing stuff in the lab, but you're also going to be, your stuff is going to be translated probably in a quicker time scale. And so here's an example of some of their direct air capture systems. Oh, please. This is what it looks like, a pilot scale for direct air capture. And you can see that you have just like these large fans where you have your basically amine-based absorbents where you can capture CO2 and then you can condense it down and then hopefully store it in geological forms, or you can use catalysis to transform it further to other chemicals. In addition to carbon capture, chemical engineers often work on materials, and so we have a lot of faculty like Professor Filler and Stinglin who are looking at how to make scalable materials for these clean energy applications. Professor Stinglin in particular is looking at how can we move away from maybe just inorganic materials for photovoltaics, and how can we move towards organic-based materials for photovoltaics so they're flexible. You could be putting solar cells on a lot of different applications if you can do that. Professor Filler is looking at how you can work on inorganic materials and how you can grow them in scalable ways, and specifically nanostructures, so you can make them cheap and useful. And so this is an example of one of their nanoscale materials that they've grown in a scalable way. We also have a lot of researchers working on separations, and so separations from a broad perspective, often in your undergrad courses, refers to distillation columns, right? But if we want to move away from fossil fuels, we're probably going to be looking at how can we decarbonize those distillation columns. We want to move away from process heat. move towards renewable electricity use. When we think about using renewable electricity for separations, we're often going to be looking at developing materials that can either operate, can regenerate at lower temperatures. And so we have a growing expertise in the area of moss synthesis for various separations, not just CO2, but also organic solvents and other commodities that for the chemical industry. We also are interested in designing materials for clean fuels and for catalysis applications as well. Professor Sievers and is one of our researchers working in the area of making sustainable feedstocks. And he does a lot of work in the area of mechanical catalysis. So mechanical catalysis is an area where you can perform catalysis at low temperatures using just electrons, where those electrons go in and they shake the mill, creating hotspots, allowing for that catalysis to take place. But the primary energy source is electricity rather than fossil fuels and heat. We also have Professor Nair, who's worked a lot on various zeolites for membrane-based separations. He does a lot with water and wastewater separations, especially for lignin separations. And so we have Professor Medford, who does a lot of computational science and data science work related to materials development for both clean catalysis and separations. And David, we didn't get you on the slide yet, but as you get to meet with David, we're really excited to have David, Professor Flattery, join us because he brings great expertise into this really growing space. And so most of this faculty on this page, we co-advise, we collaborate quite a lot. And so you're going to be running into all of us quite a lot during your PhD if you work in this space. Next, one of my things that's near and dear to my heart is electrochemistry. So electrochemistry is using electrons to do chemistry. And why not do that when we have a lot of renewable electricity? And so we have a lot of researchers, actually, I think in chemical engineering departments, your department here has one of the largest footprints of electrochemists in the nation. You might find usually one or two people working in the electrochemistry space. But here we have, 4 or 5 or 6. And so essentially we do Professor Nian Liu has been doing some really fantastic work in flow battery research for grid energy storage. We have a lot of renewable electricity. We can't use it all the times of the day. One of the greatest challenges coming up with long duration energy storage to match that renewable demand. And Professor Liu recently published a nice paper in PNAS where they showed, actually with Professor Lively, where they showed a new way that you can scale these flow batteries for grid energy storage. We also have Professor Cole and Fuller, who have been working on membranes and separation systems for both batteries, solid state batteries for electric vehicles, and then also for fuel cells and electrolysis cells for clean hydrogen production. And then, of course, I've alluded to this, but we have a really large footprint in separations from people working on theoretical work like Professor Scholl, process engineering like Professor Ralph, to materials and Professor Scott, and Bonnie Bucabella as well. So we have we run the gamut from developing the materials, understanding the processes, understanding the spectroscopy, to designing the systems as they go further. And then finally, this is just a summary slide, which, there's so many hot topics. We have lots of grants coming in, lots of funded projects. You will have, if you want to work in this space, you'll have 10 projects to choose from when you get here, on all topics from solar energy to batteries to clean hydrogen to clean fertilizers to clean water production. And so it's a really exciting time, and we really hope that if you want to work in this space that you come to Georgia Tech.
Thank you. And so next up we have Professor Vida Jamali, who's going to be talking about our efforts in nanotechnology and materials.
Hello, everyone. Some of you already met me. I'm Vida Jamali, and I'm going to talk about the general area of materials, nanoscience, and nanotechnology. I'm one of the faculty working in this research area, and I'm trying to give an overview of why this area of research to me is important, and why do we care about it, and which research groups actually work in this area. And I think one thing that you will find as you will go through these slides is that regardless of the application, whether you're working on biotechnology or catalysis, energy, and or materials, like there's always some nano and material component to that. And I think that's really what I really like about this research area. So as I was preparing the slides, I was thinking about, I was looking into different research articles, and I found this booklet that was just recently published by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine about new directions for chemical engineering. And if you haven't seen this document yet, definitely look at it, because this will give you a vision of, as you start your research career, what are the areas that will be important in the next few years. And one thing, one of the areas, of course, is materials, and the role that chemical engineers play in this area of materials, science and engineering, as well as nano. So I brought two sentences from the booklet where they talk about that chemical engineers basically are involved in and play a key role in development of new materials, processing of these materials, and at different length scales. And they bring in expertise such as theory, simulation, modeling, machine learning, and experiments to discover new materials, design new materials for the applications that we have in mind. Now, again, when you think about all of these material systems, I always think of it as that there is some building blocks component to that. And these building blocks are usually on the nanoscale. So it could be 2D materials, it could be biomolecules like proteins and DNA, it could be polymer chains, it could be nanotubes and nanowires, quantum dots or nanoparticles, inorganic nanoparticles that are a combination of organic and inorganic materials, which is MOF or metal organic framework. And these are all on the nanoscale. And so now the area of nanotechnology is basically having the ability to manipulate this matter with nanometer precision and at the nanoscale, and also the technologies that you can develop at the nanoscale. Think of like transistor devices, the tiny, tiny nanometer transistor devices that is actually right now in the chips on your phone. So we have the ability to really do this and make amazing materials with amazing properties. And the idea of looking at the nanoscale and manipulating matter at the nanoscale maybe started, of course, this is debatable. Maybe some people already were working on this area, but the starting point for nano was after this lecture that is actually on YouTube, so definitely watch this too, by Richard Feynman, who was a professor at Caltech. And he gave this lecture. There was plenty of room at the bottom, and 1959 at the American Physical Society. And basically the vision that he had for nano was that I want to build 1 billion tiny factories, models of each other, which are manufacturing simultaneously. The principles of physics, as far as I can see, do not speak against the possibility of maneuvering things atom by atom. It is not an attempt to violate any laws. It is something in principle that can be done, but in practice, it has not been done because we're just too big. But now we have all the characterization tools and the instrumentation to manipulate matter really at the nanoscale. And in today's world, if you look at it around you, nanotechnology is everywhere. It is in the rain jackets that you were wearing this morning. It is in the sunscreen that you put on your face, in your phones, and the paints that is on the wall, everywhere. And so even though this exists, there is still a lot of unanswered question at the nano, and there is still a lot of room to explore new materials that we need to develop for the future world because of all things that you have heard since morning, and because of all the challenges that the planet Earth will face in the near future. And so the one particular thing about nano that makes it interesting is that as you scale down the size, the properties and forces change. And that's a challenge, but that is also an opportunity that lets you basically play with these properties. A great example of that I always want to bring in is quantum dots, which are these tiny nanoparticles that are semiconductor. And if you have them very tiny in size, they can emit in blue. When you scale it a little bit up, like a few nanometers, it basically emits in green, and then a little bit bigger, it emits in red. And this was something that was developed in the lab, but now it is actually scaled up, and there are companies that produce them in kilograms per day. And they're commercially available in these TVs. This is not an ad for Samsung TV, but the quantum dot LED TV has these quantum dots in there, which because of the narrow emission wavelengths of this, like the line between these emissions are very narrow. And so because of that, if you put these quantum dots, actually these two, in the quantum dot TV, the whole color spectrum that the TV, the QLED TV covers is way better than the OLED TVs. And it's actually the colors are sharper. That's why when you look at the QLED TVs, the red color is so sharp compared to OLED. And I think this is a success example, like how some technology was developed in the lab and how now you have it all at home. And there are other companies that now actually use these quantum dots in the 3D. So there's still a lot of things that we want to explore and many new technologies that we want to develop. And the faculties at Georgia Tech are investing in these research areas. So I'm going to give you a snapshot of what each faculty in this area of materials and nanoscience and nanotechnology do. We have, of course, our great Tom Gardner is working on the computational modeling of fluids, polymers, and nanomaterials. His group does modeling and machine learning and to look at soft material systems, assembly of nanomaterials, looking at environmentally friendly polymer systems and processing of these. And definitely, if you have the chance, talk to him. And we have my group. What we're doing is basically looking at, I'm very interested to look at any dynamics that happen at the nanoscale. And we have now the ability using in situ electron microscopy techniques to look at these materials at the nanoscale, but also in the liquid. You're actually looking at a gold nanoparticle moving in water in this image. So you can actually visualize this, but that's not just about nanoparticles. You can look at liposomes, you can look at nano machines that are like nano tiny robots. You can look at the assembly of them, and we use machine learning to analyze their motion and assembly at the nanoscale. We have also Mike Filler's group that works on developing these nano wires. These are like, as you can see, PN junctions. So you can use them for electronics and photonics application. He's also, I think, the associate director for one of our interdisciplinary research institutes, which is the Institute of Electronics and Nanotechnology. We have 3 IRIs or interdisciplinary research institutes in this area. We have Institute for Materials, the IEN, and also the Renewable Bioproduct Institute, which I will show you some examples of that. We have Nguyen Liu. You heard about the applications of his work, but what he's doing is that he has developed one in situ optical microscopy technique that can look at the electrochemistry of these material systems and for energy storage and conversion application. We have Blair Breckman group that looks at the processing of these ultra thin fibers using electrospinning. So her group mixes these are the nickel salts that you can see mixed with a polymer that they can electrospin into fibers that are functional for textile, breathable textile fibers. We have an Natalie Stingling group that, as you heard about her earlier about her work, she works at here. We are looking at basically directed assembly of these plastic materials that have high refractive index. And so the applications for that, because of this special property, is that you can use them for making responsive photonic materials for healthcare applications. We have Carson Meredith group. He's the director of the Renewable Bioproduct Institute. You're looking at chitin nanoparticles and nanocrystals here using AFM. Image is the AFM image of that. So you can process these materials that you can get from crab shell waste, food waste, and process them into plastic packaging material. So these are an example of the renewable materials that his group make from also working from cellulose nanocrystals. We have Chris Jones' group that works on materials that are nanoporous, and the applications of these materials, as you've heard about it, is in the energy and catalysis. So he does mostly CO2 capture using these porous materials that can basically capture CO2 capture, separation, catalysis, and absorption. We also sometimes have these nanoparticles in the air, and this could be from the air pollution, for example. And Sally Yang group works on these chemistry of these aerosol nanoparticles that exist, and the effect of that on human health, developing instrumentation and characterization tool to study the life cycle of these aerosol materials in the air. And then we have Sad Baumlaw's group. His group is interested, you heard a little bit about when he was describing, he's interested in looking at biological systems like animals and getting inspiration from them and developing bio-inspired materials. An example of that is the sand grouse that apparently has these feathers that can hold water and then carry the water to the babies of these sand grouse. And so he's studying how does this feather have this ability to change the morphology and store water and then carry it for a certain amount of minutes. And so by studying these, they can actually develop materials later based on these materials, biological materials. We also have Victor Rietveld group. He looks at the surface properties and bedding phenomena. So how can you manipulate the interfacial tension to basically have different bedding properties for different liquids? You can see an example of how different the contact angle would be in these systems. And this is a technology like the Gore-Tex and the rain jacket, that this is exactly the similar technology we're talking about. I have Moldovan group that looks at the nanoscale, how the mass and heat transfer happens and how you can develop new photonics and electronics at the nanoscale technology using the principles that you can learn from heat and mass transport at the nanoscale. And we have Paul Cold group that looks at conducting polymers for making basically these energy storage and conversion devices, for making fuel cells that you can see here. And he's like, I think actually Marta left the room, but there is a big institute that recently that was just funded by him and Marta. So definitely one of the very cool research areas that I totally suggest that you talk to him or Marta about it. And then we have Yunan Shah that works on developing these synthesizing these nanoparticles that have unique shape and properties. An example of that is like he's very famous for making these very sharp edge nanocubes that have applications in catalysis. And as I was mentioning, we have one of the interdisciplinary research institutes, which is the Institute for Electronics and Nanotechnology, that also includes our material characterization facility. And this is one of the best in the country. So it is, you will, as you walk out the Ford building, and maybe at some point you're going to pass by this building, but you're going to see it. It's not something that you cannot notice. It is Marcus Nanotechnology building, which has most of our characterization tools, but also our clean room, which is one of a kind in the country. So I think this is bringing a huge, like a very big opportunity for us to manipulate materials at the nanoscale. You can do nanolithography, you can do different type of electron microscopies, and yeah, anything that you can imagine. And there's also the many collaborations that happen out of these research institutes. So this is a very interesting thing. And you will get to talk to the faculty involved in this, including and Tom. And with this, I want to thank you, and I would be happy to answer any question.
Thank you, Vida. And then finally, last but not least, we have Professor Fani Bukovala to talk about complex systems and process systems engineering in our department.
I'm Fani Bukovala. I will talk to you about the last area here. That's a little different from all the others that kind of focused on a particular grand challenge or a particular application area. And is defined as complex systems. You see the definition we have on our website here. The idea is we have a lot of projects here at Georgia Tech, as you will see, that span many diverse applications, but the underlying methods, the data collection, the data processing, the optimization algorithms, the computational techniques, the high performance computing, and all of that is what we innovate in to solve some of these very complex systems. So I have here some snapshots from all the different areas, from chemical evolution to polymer informatics to reaction networks to very traditional process designs type of stuff that you did in your undergrad, to brain activity, metabolic networks, and even air quality that sort of fall within this complex systems area. But I've always struggled to kind of put boundaries around what this is, because everything you've heard today is essentially a complex system, right? So I turn to ChatGPT. So how many of you have used it or heard about it? Okay. So I asked what complex systems, chemical and biomolecular engineering in simple terms. And I don't know if you can see this, but it did a pretty good job. A complex system it refers to a group of many interacting components or parts that together create complex and often unpredictable behavior. These systems involve chemical reactions, biological processes. For example, a chemical reactor is a complex system. It involves a complex system. It involves many chemical reactions, and they interact with each other. In biomolecular engineering, biological systems have many interacting molecules, cells, tissues, and so on. You heard about examples of that earlier today from Julie. Overall, complex systems are important to study and understand as they can help us design more efficient and effective processes for creating chemicals, drugs, other products, and gaining biological insights. I couldn't have explained it better, so I did a pretty good job. And then I played around with it a bit more, and I said, okay, describe that like a stand-up comedian would. And it's not that funny, but have you heard of complex systems? They're like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're gonna get. One example is a chemical reactor. It's like a game of Jenga, that different chemical reactions. Another one is a distillation column. It's like a giant game of Tetris. There's fluid dynamics. It's like a dance party. You've got molecules dancing around and bumping into each other. The really nice one is complex systems in chemical engineering is like a comedy routine. Sometimes you nail it, sometimes you bomb, but it's always entertaining and you learn something new along the way. So that pretty much sums up my entire presentation. So you'll see throughout this talk that essentially the unifying theme is that we have a lot of work going on here at Tech, thinking of systems from a systems perspective, a bunch of interconnected pieces. It has projects that span throughout all the areas that you just heard about. And so we'll see examples of how we develop methods to collect and process really large data sets, how we develop methods to model these systems, and make conclusions that without a lot of these tools, you know, would be really difficult to actually do. Okay. So within this complex systems theme, data science and machine learning, you've heard the term in many of the areas introduced earlier, is becoming a very frequent term, and we're building a lot of research expertise and we're leading a lot of areas of application or advancement of data science at Georgia Tech. You see here, we have a lot of people, including people you've heard about today, Tom, Vida, and a lot of that I'll talk about in my presentation that are actually either using very state-of-the-art machine learning tools for chemical systems, or even developing new methods that are specifically targeted for chemical engineering systems. So the tool behind ChatGPT, which is kind of why I put it in the presentation, has a background of us using sort of a data-driven algorithm to train with data from all over the internet to give us these answers. And it works pretty well, right? So those are the tools that we're using. But the thing is that, okay, if ChatGPT gave me a slightly wrong answer for this kind of question, it's not a big deal. I should have the ability to actually understand if it's a good answer or not. But when we apply some of these tools for chemical processes, if we make a mistake, it could be detrimental. So we do need new techniques and customization of these techniques. And we do need chemical engineers to work on these problems because they do have the chemical engineering knowledge to know when to apply them safely, ethically, and so on. Okay. We not only innovate in this field of data science research in chemical engineering, we also have developed and launched in 2019 a graduate certificate on data science for chemical engineers. This is the first type of credential in this space. And if you come here as graduate students, you are required to take a minor. So this, if you pick these courses, you will get a data science minor, and also you will get this actual certificate, which is accredited, even if your research area is not in this topic. Okay, and we have several participants so far, and this is a program that was created also for industrial professionals. So you see here a list of some of the companies that have sent people who actually work there to get retrained on these techniques. And part of the program, we make it a point to actually group you with these people. Sometimes they bring in the real data set from their companies, and it's a good networking and professional development opportunity as well. So the other general theme within complex systems area is the area that I work in, process systems engineering. So if you haven't heard of this sort of subfield of chemical engineering before, we're usually the people that teach capstone design. We have one of the largest groups in the country in the area of process systems engineering here at Tech, including myself, Dr. Grover, Dr. Ralph, Dr. Scott, and Dr. Sahinidis. We all do a lot of computational research. We work a lot with all of our colleagues working on different application areas, and we help them develop models, optimize their systems or control their systems, and even come up with novel algorithms and tools and software that we release for people to solve complex systems that involve data and information across scales, from the nanoscale all the way to the supply chain, or merging different forms of data. Data nowadays comes in all sorts of forms, from kinetic data, time series data, images, videos, and so on. So how do we merge all of that with computational techniques to develop better models and better decision-making tools? So I'll start now going through snapshots of all the different projects that kind of fall under this theme. I'll go really fast. So if you want more details, please make sure you talk to the people. And this is just to show you sort of the diversity of complex systems area. I'll start with the process systems faculty, and then I'll go beyond that. And I'll selfishly start with my lab. So we are the data-driven process systems engineering lab. We really do what I was just telling you about, merge data science with chemical engineering principles. We develop optimization algorithms that rely on data, and we apply them and collaborate a lot with a lot of faculty to model process separation systems, bioreactor control, plastics recycling, which is another big area that's emerging here in the department that I think you didn't really get to hear about. I'll move on to Dr. Ralph, who is actually a pioneer in this area of machine learning. He was doing machine learning during his PhD when no one really even knew what that was. So he works a lot on developing really rigorous simulations for complex processes, a very strong focus on separations, and he works in this space of optimizing processes based on the materials you put in, which is a really large search space. And he also uses a lot of machine learning to do that. And just to give you an idea of the diversity that can exist in some of these groups, he works not only on separations, but he also works with Dr. Wilson on actually using the same kind of mathematical tools to design intelligent microbes. So I don't really have the time to go into detail, but please make sure you talk to them about these things. And we have Dr. Grover that actually also uses multi-scale information from molecular data and all the way down to the atomistic scale in machine learning, and trying to actually understand how life started on Earth. That's what the origins of life story is about. So how were the first macromolecules formed, organized, and how did the first types of biological functions start to emerge? But she also uses a lot of that expertise to design organic electronics and polymer composites. So using, again, molecular simulations, image analysis and image data and machine learning to understand the process structure property relationships of materials that go into photovoltaics, biological sensors, and many more. Then we have Professor Sahinidis, who's actually a pioneer in the area of developing actual software that is used very, very widely across the globe to globally optimize lots of different systems, not just in chemical engineering. So he's been a chemical engineer his entire life, but we have a lot of complex systems in chemical engineering, and it turns out that if we combine the math and the challenges we have, we can develop a lot of software that can be used to find really good global optimal solutions for a vast range of problems. And this is just a list of all the software that he has released, and he even has a company actually that commercializes some of these tools. So there's some innovation and even opportunities to participate in things like that. And finally, in the process systems area, we have Dr. Scott, who also works in developing next generation of algorithms for simulation, optimization, and control. He looks at really, really large problems with millions of degrees of freedom, not just traditional chemical process flow sheets, but goes all the way up to looking at power grids that are essentially like chemical process flow sheets. But he also does a lot of work on dynamic modeling and optimization, and looking at really developing techniques that quantify the uncertainty of predictions of some of these techniques. And these can be applied not just to chemical reactions, but all the way up to, he's done work on controlling a fighter jet trajectory so that it doesn't crash. So you can see, again, the diversity of same types of techniques and tools that are applied to a very interesting set of applications. Now, if we go beyond the process systems folks, we have Dr. Medford that uses a lot of computational techniques, EFD calculation, lots of data, and machine learning to understand complex reaction networks. And you heard about his work also earlier today in catalysis, but he doesn't only stay at the quantum level, he also goes all the way up to reactor modeling and trying to understand how the material, the catalyst, actually performs within a reactor through microkinetic models. We have Dr. Sosinski, who explains how a cell is essentially a microbial factory. So it's like a chemical process flow sheet, but if we had to actually draw the PFD diagram of a cell, it looks like this. So it's a really complicated, interconnected system. And his group does a lot of work on modeling this type of process system. The metabolism is huge, and we need customized modeling and optimization techniques to actually try to understand what's happening or control it. And then finally, we have Dr. Liu, who studies brain function. Very different application, very complex system. So she has developed, and her group, they've developed techniques to gather lots and lots of data from these worms. They have used machine learning and data science to actually try to, understand what is happening in the brain and how different external stimulation affects what's happening in the brain, and how can we link brain activities to actually brain states and different types of decision making. So this involves developing new mathematical tools to do all this sort of thing, because we're talking about very complex data. And finally, the mostly experimental kind of complex system, but I'll spend very little time on it because you heard about it from Vida, is Dr. Eng, who played a really huge role here on campus through COVID. So she has great experimental techniques to gather a lot of data to try to understand the complex chemistry of aerosols in the air. She tries to even link that to how that affects our human health. And this problem wasn't complicated enough that we also have an example of Dr. Liu and Eng partnering together to automate through microfluidic devices, collection and processing of data from the atmosphere to health real time. Okay, so that essentially kind of sums up some of the important snapshots of what types of things we do here at Georgia Tech in terms of analyzing huge complex data set systems and techniques that we develop. And make sure you actually talk to the people you saw for more details.
Okay, thank you so much. All right, thanks to all of you for listening